The celebration in the banquet hall was a sight to behold. Big round tables draped in champagne-colored cloth, the hum of gentle laughter, the clink of glasses. It was a special Sunday evening, and the retirement party in honor of Richard Collins, the patriarch of the Collins family, was in full swing. For 40 years, Richard had worked relentlessly at McKinley Precision Engineering in the outskirts of Chicago, rising to become head of operations. Tonight, his friends, colleagues, and extended family surrounded him, each face shining with affection and respect. Between the speeches, people traded old stories. There were toasts, many appreciative, a few wistful, and more smiles than the Collins family had seen in years. It all felt almost too perfect, a classic American milestone, that rare gathering where family histories, shared dreams, and moments of hard work converge into a single joyful memory. This, it seemed, was the very picture of a happy family. And then, quite suddenly, everything changed. Richard, ever the stoic, stood up slowly. His back was straight, shoulders squared in that unfailing way. Without so much as a nervous glance, he looked directly at his eldest daughter, Margaret. "Margaret and you, Stephen," he began, his voice steady but louder than before. "I want you both to leave. Right now. And from now on, do not call me Dad." In an instant, the warmth of the room evaporated. Heads swiveled, forks paused halfway to mouths. An icy silence blanketed the whole hall, as if the world itself had frozen. The crowd sat paralyzed, unsure whether to speak, whether to move, unable to quite believe what they'd just witnessed. In the stillness that followed, Stephen, Margaret's husband, quietly pushed back his chair. He stood, not making a scene. Reaching into his suit pocket, he drew out a single business card and held it in his palm. Bowing his head in a gesture of old-fashioned grace, he addressed the room, but his words were for Richard. "Please excuse us," Stephen said, his voice calm and even. "But when you realize what this card means, it may change what you think you know about this family." Stephen placed the card gently before Richard and, still offering a respectful nod, guided Margaret away. The eyes of every person in that hall trailed after them. Richard's hand trembled as he accepted the card. When he read it, all the color drained from his face. His jaw went slack. The room waited, tensely, as the consequences rippled outward. Though few would ever understand what that simple card truly represented. Margaret Collins was born in a historic, tight-knit neighborhood in the old suburbs west of Chicago. As the eldest of 3 daughters, she'd always been told she was expected to carry herself with grace to be, as her aunts liked to say, the face of the family. Her childhood was measured in proper manners and perfectly starched dresses. She knew to say please and thank you, to speak only when spoken to, and always, always, to think of how the family would appear to others. But nothing in her upbringing held more sway than her father's pride. Richard Collins was a man who prized discipline and public image above all. At work, he was legendary for his iron will. At home, he expected no less. His daughter's futures, the family's reputation, and what the neighbors might say, mattered more than individual happiness or fleeting dreams. "In this family, the worst sin you can commit is to bring shame on our name," he would say. Coming from his mouth, the phrase sounded like a commandment, something chiseled in stone. Despite that pressure, Margaret possessed a quiet stubbornness that not even her father could stamp out. Her teachers praised her talent for literature and creative writing, suggesting, more than once, that she ought to consider becoming a novelist or writing poetry for a living. Margaret herself harbored a fierce love of words, scribbling stories in the margins of her textbooks long after her bedtime. But her father had no time for such so-called nonsense. He scoffed, "You can't put food on the table by daydreaming. I won't have one of my daughters wasting her life chasing fantasy." By the time Margaret turned 18, her options had been whittled down to 2. Either major in economics or pre-law, or find some way to pay for college on her own. That was the line in the sand. Margaret, after months of hesitation and late-night tears, finally decided to pursue her dream. She applied to the English program at a respected East Coast university, knowing exactly what her choice would cost. When she broke the news, her father's response was short and scornful. "You can forget about my money. You're on your own, Margaret." Her mother, Evelyn, flinched as she drew a sharp breath, and Margaret never forgot the shudder that ran through her mother's shoulders that morning. From then on, Richard acted as if Margaret no longer existed. She became a ghost in her own home. Mealtimes passed in silence. Her sisters averted their eyes, even family friends, once warm, treaded carefully around her presence. That spring, at 21, Margaret packed her life into 3 battered cardboard boxes and a single navy blue backpack. Slipping quietly out of the house before dawn, she left no note, no backward glance, and not a single goodbye. Those first few years on her own were nothing if not humbling. Margaret waited tables in a quirky coffee shop in downtown Providence by day, and worked as a tutor and copy-editor at night. She rented the cheapest attic room she could find, and when the world slept, she kept the lamp burning and wrote short stories, scripts, scraps of poetry, because it was the only way she knew to survive. "I have to make a life out of my words," she told herself on nights when her resolve faltered. Holding on to her stubborn hope, she worked harder than she thought possible. Luck finally smiled on her when she landed a job as an assistant scriptwriter. At a small media production firm, the days were long, but the paychecks kept coming. She felt stable for the first time. It was there, amid cluttered storyboards and the late-night buzz of creative minds, that she met her future husband, Stephen Parker. Stephen was 2 years younger. Already an up-and-coming designer, he was known around the office for his oddball brilliance and unflappable composure. They were drawn together by their shared love of language and expression. In time, their friendship blossomed into love, and the two moved in together in a cramped but cozy apartment in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Later, over a quiet dinner, they promised each other a future and held a modest wedding surrounded by a handful of friends and Stephen's family. But when Margaret mailed the wedding announcement back home, she received only silence in return. There was no reply, not even a note scrawled in her mother's careful hand. Her name was missing from every family Christmas card. At family funerals, she noticed the way people looked through her, never at her. If the Collins family needed to send anything official, her name always appeared misspelled, almost as if by deliberate design. "I guess I really don't belong to that family anymore," Margaret thought. Each time the realization sent a spike of pain through her chest. Stephen stood by, unshakable in his quiet support. He never pressured her to reconnect. He loved her as she was. "You're the strongest person I know," he'd remind her on hard days. "You chose your own path." That was the right thing to do. Yet even so, there were nights when Margaret lay awake, haunted by memories of her father's broad shoulders, his rare but precious praise. "Maybe I only ever wanted him to see me for who I am," she sometimes admitted to herself, embarrassed even by the thought. Her father's criticism, her mother's silence, her grandparents' cold stares, all of it combined to push Margaret away, leaving her stranded at the edge of what had once felt like her only home. But she lived each day with care, and little by little she built a new life. Margaret collected tiny triumphs, winning a regional short story contest, being published in a national magazine. People started asking her to run workshops or give readings. She found herself teaching, despite her shyness. One student, a bright-eyed teenage girl, sent her a thank you note that changed everything. "Your words saved me. I think I'll try believing in my own path, too." With those few lines, a sense of clarity snapped into place. Even if she never won her father's approval, she realized her words could matter deeply to someone else. Maybe, just maybe, she could let go of the loneliness, trading it for a sense of purpose. Early March, years after she'd left home, Margaret received an envelope. There was no return address. Instead, her family name, Collins, was printed above the addressee in bland computer font. Her name and Stephen's were both spelled wrong. At first, she thought nothing of it, but a chill swept through her, one she couldn't quite explain. Inside was a formal invitation to her father's retirement celebration at the Wyndham Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago. Time, date, dress code, all laid out methodically in Times New Roman. No hint of warmth, nothing handwritten. The message concluded, "We'd greatly appreciate your attendance." It felt as impersonal as any bank notice. To Margaret, the invitation made her feel like a colleague, not a daughter. That night, as she set the envelope on the kitchen table and began chopping onions for dinner, the phone rang. Her phone screen flashed the name, Rebecca, her younger sister. Her hand hesitated before she answered. "So, you got the invitation?" Rebecca said, voice measured, barely above a whisper. "Yeah, but my name was wrong." A brief silence. "If you can, please come," Rebecca whispered. "If you don't, they'll just say, you're ungrateful again." With that, Rebecca hung up, the hush settling around Margaret like a fog. Why now? After so many years of silence from a father who once acted as if she didn't exist? The whole thing felt like a formality. Yet behind Rebecca's voice, there was something trembling and uneasy, something that tugged at Margaret in ways she had thought she'd outgrown. As the days counted down to her father's retirement banquet, Margaret considered what it would mean to show up to return, not as the outcast daughter, but as a woman shaped by her own choices. She didn't want apology or acceptance. She just wanted, finally, honestly, to be seen. And that, in a way, was what gave her the strength to walk through those imposing double doors on the night that changed everything. The clinking glasses, the staged family photo, the firm handshake from her father's oldest friend, it all seemed to blur and sharpen in turns. But when Richard Collins, in front of everyone, tried again to cast her out, it was her husband who gave Margaret a hand to hold and a reason to keep standing tall, no matter the words exchanged. No matter the tremors of old wounds reopening, Margaret understood, at last, that the family she'd built with Stephen, the words she'd sent out into the world, and the new meaning she'd discovered in her work could never be erased. Not by her father's shame or the neighbor's gossip, nor by an invitation with the wrong name. In that moment, Margaret found her own home inside herself, inside the lives she'd quietly touched. And that, in the end, was enough. That night, seated side by side at their small round kitchen table, Margaret and Stephen quietly shared their dinner. Outside, dusk pressed against the windows, sending a pale blue glow across the dishes, as if the city beyond were gently reminding them that life, no matter how tangled, keeps moving forward. Suddenly, Margaret broke the silence with a soft murmur. "I think I'm going to go." Her voice was steady, but Stephen heard the tremor hiding underneath. Stephen set his fork down, offering her a gentle, reassuring smile. "You don't have to force yourself, you know." Margaret nodded, eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I know. But I just have this feeling. Like maybe I should for my own sake. I can't explain it." Though her tone was calm, a shadow of worry drifted across her face. For a moment, they sat in silence, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic their only company. Stephen eventually spoke again, warmth in each word. "Then let's go. We'll do this as invited guests, polite and quiet. No expectations, no drama." Margaret let out a breath, a tiny, grateful laugh escaping her lips. She nodded deeply, a sense of resolve flickering in her eyes. No expectations, no demands, just respect for the occasion. This choice, she realized, eased her heart, if only just a little. The next morning, Margaret opened the closet she hadn't touched in ages. The invitation specified semi-formal, an oddly sterile phrase, but one she respected. She sifted through her dresses, brushing her fingers across each fabric. The right color purse, the subtle handbag, the perfect pair of shoes. Her hair. She considered if she'd leave it down or pin it up in the old simple twist her mother once taught her. Moving through these rituals, piece by piece, Margaret felt almost like a priestess preparing for a sacred event. There was a reverence, a seriousness about wanting to honor the moment, even if her presence was barely wanted. Stephen, as usual, was calm. He quietly picked out a deep gray tie, waxed his shoes until they gleamed, and snuck glances at Margaret while he worked. "You're putting a lot of care into this." She paused, politely smiling. "I am. After all, this could be the last time. Her voice, though quiet, rang with a clarity that surprised them both. Then came the day of the party. It was a chilly, early spring morning. A restless hint of winter still clung to the Chicago wind. Margaret and Stephen drove downtown, hands knit together on the center console. They didn't have words for the mood between them, so they sat in companionable silence, the radio songs passing by in a blur. Margaret watched the concrete slip past the window and found her thoughts drifting to the memory of her father's broad back, that immovable line of his jaw. The last sharp sentence he'd ever hurled at her. "You're not one of us anymore." That phrase, after all these years, still sat on her heart like a stone. And yet, today there was a stir of something new. Not relief, not hope exactly, but a quiet recognition. Still, I am here, as myself. Margaret had been living her own life for years now, forging her path in her own voice. She had not asked for validation, nor needed approval. She had survived on her own merit, and perhaps, she thought, that was enough. On the short walk from the parking lot toward the hotel, Stephen looked at her, concern creasing his brow. "Nervous?" She shook her head. "No, I think I'm all right, just a little unsettled inside. If you want to leave, at any moment, we'll just go. No explanations needed." She smiled. "Thank you." That simple exchange was all they needed. Hand in hand, they moved beneath the grand covered entrance of the Wyndham Grand. Past the sliding glass doors, the party glittered beneath chandeliers. Laughter and soft music blended with the clinking of champagne flutes and the low swirl of conversation. Margaret drew a deep breath, steeling herself, and together they crossed the threshold. This was more than just a step inside a hotel ballroom. It was Margaret's quiet, unwavering step toward her past, toward all the things that had once left her. Feeling so small, and now could no longer truly touch her. The banquet hall, nestled in the heart of Chicago's bustling downtown, shone like a scene from a classic movie. The carpet was a deep red plush beneath their feet. Heavy gold trim ringed the walls. Arrangements of fresh lilies and roses surrounded the shining grand piano at the front of the room. Waiters in crisp uniforms and white gloves glided among the guests, offering greetings and expertly poured drinks. This night, people had come from everywhere to honor Richard Collins Margaret's father on his retirement from McKinley Precision Engineering. Surrounded by old colleagues, a string of family members, even some old neighbors, Richard sat at the head table. A gold ribbon, pinned carefully to his lapel, gleamed under the lights. His wife, Evelyn, sat beside him, hands folded neatly in her lap. Though his face revealed little, Richard's posture was as proud and unmoving as ever. He received guests with a firm handshake and a stiff nod, his bearing unmistakably that of a man who no longer worked but had ruled over his domain. As Margaret and Stephen entered, a few relatives eyed them, quick flickers of recognition that, just as quickly, vanished behind polite indifference. No one waved, no one called her name. So it's like this, Margaret thought. Yet on her features, she made sure to hold a gentle, dignified smile. A staff member ushered them to a round table on the far side of the hall. They settled in, and Stephen leaned over, offering his encouragement in a voice meant only for her. "It's a beautiful space, isn't it? Just remember, I'm here, right next to you." Those words pulled a hint of warmth to Margaret's lips. She nodded, feeling herself lifted by his unwavering comfort. The evening unfolded exactly as planned. An MC recounted Richard's history at the company. One speech flowed into the next. Stories of his precision, his power, his occasional humor. Plates of perfectly prepared salmon and steak appeared. Alongside glasses of sparkling wine filled to the brim. Just as dessert was being served, the room's focus shifted. The MC took up the microphone and addressed the crowd. "At this time, we would like to invite a family member to offer a few words for Mr. Collins on this special occasion." A ripple ran through the crowd, dozens of eyes searching, some expectant, others cautious. Before anyone could prompt her, Margaret stood tall. A soft gasp, barely more than a whisper, broke the hush. Margaret lifted her glass and walked slowly toward the front. The light cast a gentle glow on her black dress. All chatter ceased. A hush fell, as if the whole room held its breath. She was handed the microphone. Margaret bowed her head, a small, respectful nod, and began. "Thank you for the honor of being here tonight." As Richard Collins' daughter, that was as far as she got. A cold, hard voice crashed through her words, slicing the air clean. "Stop right there. I don't care to hear those empty words." The crowd froze. It was Richard himself. He stood, arms crossed, eyes burning into hers. "You don't have any right to give a speech. You turned your back on this family. Who do you think you are, calling yourself my daughter now?" A paralysis gripped the room. No one moved. No one spoke. Margaret clung to the microphone, unmoving. Surprise didn't cross her face. Instead, she almost seemed gentler, closing her eyes for just a fraction of a second. And when she opened them, she spoke quietly, her voice even and unwavering. "I have always felt proud to be your daughter. You were never easy, but I know better than anyone how much you gave for this family. That's why, tonight, I hoped." "Enough," Richard snapped, cutting her off with all the old razor-edge sharpness. "You've said more than enough. Leave. Now. I don't want you here, not tonight, not ever." As his words hammered down, a silence more solid than stone filled the room. The kind of silence that bends the air, that buries all sound beneath it. Margaret carefully set her glass back on the table. She handed the microphone to the MC, then looked slowly around the hall, her face composed and unbowed. She bowed her head. "Please excuse me." Without another word, she turned to return to her seat. Stephen, at her side, quietly stood as well. For a brief moment, he picked up his own glass. Then, wordlessly, set it down again, as if to say, "Not worth a response." No toast, no speech, no argument. That simple gesture was all the reply he needed. Stephen squeezed Margaret's hand, his eyes meeting hers. "Are you all right?" The question, simple as it was, shielded her from the cold and the humiliation. She would never, could never, find the words to describe how much that small kindness meant just then. And so, with heads held high, they crossed back out into the city night. The world outside was the same: car horns, flashing lights, wind. But the space between Margaret and Stephen had changed into something stronger, steadier. In the fullest measure of things, Margaret realized that dignity cannot be taken, not even by the one who gave you your name. That night in the grand hall, though she was cast out once again, Margaret understood she already belonged to her own hard-won life, to the partner who never wavered, and, at last, to herself. Margaret Collins returned to her table, moving quietly among a sea of clinking glasses and polite laughter inside the Wyndham Grand Hotel. She picked up her water glass, letting her fingers settle around the cold stem, its chill bringing a bit of calm to her still trembling hands. She wasn't especially thirsty. What she truly needed was something grounding, some tangible solidity to remind her she was real, that she belonged here, even as the fabric of the evening had begun to unravel. Stephen, her husband, sat beside her, his presence steady and silent. He was folding his napkin, slow and precise, his gaze soft and level. The table before them glistened, linen cloth of pristine white, clusters of golden cutlery neatly aligned, the warm glow of the chandeliers above painting everything in gentle, shifting light. It all felt a touch staged now, like a holiday meal arranged for a magazine, where behind every corner hid secrets the pictures would never show. Somewhere across the hall, someone tipped over a glass, and a sharp sound cut through the hum. For a second, low murmurs swept the room, only to be smoothed over by fresh laughter and another swell of applause, as if the disturbance had been nothing more than a passing breeze. It was, Margaret thought, the very image of how this family, and perhaps the whole night, dealt with discomfort. A tiny ripple in the air, dismissed as quickly as possible, covered up with a forced smile or a quick change of subject. She knew, without doubt, that not a single person would call her name or speak of what had taken place. At the microphone, the people at the tables nearby kept their eyes drifting, never meeting hers, their conversations skimming along the surface. Margaret caught snatches of whispers. Well, there must be some old story there. Don't you think? It was the sort of silence that says everything, heavy, knowing, carefully maintained. Margaret drew her hand to her chest, feeling for the outline of the necklace she wore. It was a simple piece. One she'd bought as a self-congratulation when she'd graduated. No help from anyone. Not even a kind word from her father. That small gesture now, fingertips pressing lightly to the pendant, was her way of saying to herself, "You made your choices. You made your choices. You walked this path." It was a quiet reaffirmation of her own history, of the small, stubborn source of pride deep inside her chest. As she sat in that silent reverie, a server approached, setting down the last course with practiced grace, a perfectly cooked steak, artfully ringed by colorful roasted vegetables. Margaret looked at her plate but did not reach for her fork. The air in her lungs felt tight, her appetite long vanished. Stephen's voice broke the quiet between them, soft and meant only for her. "You're not going to eat it all?" She shook her head. Her reply, gentle yet tinged with a private resolve. "No, I just can't. Not right now." Her tone was not weak. There was a steel threaded through her words, a steadiness born not of anger but of endurance. Stephen nodded, understanding without pressing. A few minutes passed. Then the MC, his face familiar and friendly, took the microphone to move the celebration onward. There would be photos projected onto the big screen, gifts for the retiree, and greetings from old business associates. In that crowd, with the lights lowered and the slides flickering, Margaret felt almost invisible, as if her very presence had faded into something translucent, a ghost moving through the halls of her own family's past. Stephen, though, was different. He watched the proceedings, his jaw set and his eyes keen, clearly taking slow measure of the room and the shifting tides within it. As he scanned the crowd, he reached into the inside pocket of his suit, his hands searching with intent. His fingers found a black, heavy card, the kind that was rarely given, meant not for casual introductions, but to declare a name and a legacy. Margaret glanced at him, catching that small action. Though its meaning didn't settle fully on her then, she looked across the ballroom to the stage, to the place where her father stood. There was Richard Collins, standing tall, squared shoulders, chin raised, the picture of ironclad pride, as he always had been. Yet Margaret caught a tightness around his eyes, a stiffness betraying the pressure he felt. It was the barest flicker, quickly masked for the crowd, but not lost on the daughter who had watched him her whole life. Why was he so determined to keep her out? Why, after all these years, was her mere presence something to hide? A shame to be buried rather than a daughter to be welcomed? At this moment, what Margaret wanted more than anything was not to measure what she'd lost, but to understand what was it that Richard Collins clung to so fiercely that there could be no place for her differences within it. "I don't want your approval," she thought fiercely. "I only ever wanted to be seen, not as a daughter with a debt to pay or a wayward child to be scolded, but as a person." She never said these words aloud, but in her silence, the meaning rang out, clear as church bells inside her heart. The entire scene held a hush-like air just before a storm. Stephen had already placed his business card in the most accessible spot on the table in front of him. The card was black, solid, with a sober sheen, an unmistakable statement. It was his mark, his claim to who he was, a gesture he had never felt the need to make in any family setting before. And at last, the moment arrived. The house lights dimmed, the crowd settled as the projectors cast a sequence of old photographs across a widescreen, shots of Richard Collins as a young man in the factory, arm in arm with colleagues, beaming as he lifted an award before management, family pictures arranged for holiday cards, except, in some, the spot where Margaret should have stood was conspicuously empty. The display was history and pride, curated and selective, a record meticulously assembled to tell only part of the story. The entire hall filled with applause for the man of the hour. Near the front, someone murmured, "He's lived an exceptional life." A few seats away, another, "He's a self-made man. You really have to admire it." Only Stephen, at Margaret's side, remained unchanged. He watched the images with a stillness that said more than any speech. Then, as the slideshow faded and the lights came up, Stephen quietly stood. A silence, heavier than any before, fell over the crowd. Faces turned toward him in unison, mouths startled mid-sentence, hands stilled over untouched bread rolls. Stephen moved with purpose to the stage, where Richard Collins presided. He gave a tiny bow of respect, meeting Richard's gaze. Then, holding the black card with both hands, he offered it forward as if presenting a testament. A beat of hush, short, sharp, eternal. Richard, surprised, reached out and accepted the card. His eyes held on the business logo and the name inked in white. For a second, his hand trembled. The card read, Minato Creative Research NC. CEO, Founder, Stephen Parker Headquarters, 520 West 42nd Street, New York, NY. Though only a few in the room recognized it immediately, Minato had become a name known throughout the digital marketing world. A rising tech company covered regularly in national business magazines, praised for bold campaigns and billion-dollar projects. On that card was written the truth. The very man who had married Richard's outcast daughter was now one of America's most respected and feared industry leaders. In an instant, whispers coursed through the party. Someone fired up a phone, browsing for the company name, eyes growing wider with each fresh search result. That can't be the same Minato, can it? My God, Stephen Parker? That's really him? Richard Collins was frozen, the card still in his hand. A look crossed his face, one Margaret had never seen before, a mixture of confusion, regret, and sudden, wild uncertainty. Stephen faced him calmly, voice level and polite but carrying an unmistakable gravity. Thank you for including us tonight. It meant a great deal to Margaret, to us both, to be part of your celebration. But I believe it's best if we take our leave now. This is your night, and we shouldn't disrupt the spirit of things any further. There was no anger in his words, no hint of payback, only an unshakable boundary, a line set with dignity, courtesy, and a definite sense of parting. He bowed once, laid the card gently on the podium, and descended from the stage. No one dared move. Around the room, eyes glanced back and forth, breaths held, every guest caught in the shock and the awkwardness and the unspoken sense that something momentous had just shifted. On the stage, Richard stood alone, staring at the card, unable to summon up a single word. The room waited, the tension stretching nearly to breaking. At their table, Margaret rose to her feet. She stepped toward Stephen, took his hand in both of hers, and together, shoulders straight, walking without hurry, they turned and moved toward the double doors. Each step was slow, deliberate, filled with a resolve that nobody present could hope to challenge. They walked out side by side, their pace unhurried, almost stately, a display of assurance that spoke to everything they had endured, and everything they were choosing for themselves from this moment on. And behind them, the party continued as if nothing had happened. But what had changed, in those quiet minutes, would echo through both their lives and Richard's far longer than any speech or photo ever could. For Margaret, it would become the measure of her hope and healing, a sign that dignity, once seized and held tightly, would never again be lost. That is how Margaret Collins reclaimed her place, not as a daughter asking forgiveness, not as an exile begging to return, but as herself, whole, proud, unbroken, and absolutely free. All anyone could do was watch their backs as Margaret and Stephen strode out of the ballroom and out of the hotel. Nobody in the grand hall moved to stop them. Some people pressed their lips together to hide fraught emotions, others bowed their heads, a few simply stared after the pair with dumbfounded eyes. And then, at that very moment, for the first time that evening, Richard Collins, the father, found his voice. It came out low, shaking, cracking along the edges with emotion he'd never shown in public before. Texie, you, really. But just as the next words seemed ready to tumble out, Richard swallowed them, leaving the sentence hanging, strangled and unfinished. Stephen did not even turn around. With his hand guiding Margaret forward, he addressed the room behind them, his voice calm, gentle, even with nothing but a quiet warmth. Please, take good care of yourself. That was all. He faced forward again, opened the doors, and disappeared with Margaret, their shoulders straight and unbowed, into the night. The doors of the banquet hall closed softly behind them. At once, the brittle, icy tension that had hovered over the celebration shattered. Suddenly voices sprang back, first in whispers, then in soft clumps of speculation, as if the whole room had released a breath it hadn't known it was holding. He was a remarkable man, wasn't he? How did we not know? So that's who Margaret's married to. Yet, Richard Collins still stood unmoving on the stage, unable to utter a word. In the palm of his hand, all that remained was a single black business card, cool and weighty, glimmering softly in the stage lights. The truth that hit him hardest, the person he'd always looked down on was, in reality, further above him than he'd ever imagined. The daughter he'd dismissed as worthless had, by all signs, lived with greater honesty and conviction than he ever recognized. All of this was laid bare to everyone, captured there, as if in a silent flash, by a single card. As Richard's mind reeled, another memory years old, long buried, emerged, fresh and insistent. The words Margaret had spoken the night she left her childhood home behind. I may never be a daughter you're proud of, Dad, but I will walk my own road, on my own strength. He'd said nothing to her then, simply turning his back and closing himself off. Now, the words he never found, the words he should have spoken, gathered, and churned deep in his throat, bitter as regret itself. Up on that stage, frozen in place, Richard could not move a muscle. In his fist, the black card rested silently, much heavier than a slip of paper. Had any right to be. The world around him blurred, as if he were gazing down at his own life from a distance. Nearby, someone murmured words of congratulations, but the meaning simply faded away. What lay in his hand? One plain rectangle was enough to rattle everything he'd ever defined as pride or success. It was a soundless, seismic shift, shaking his bones. I didn't know. No. I never even tried to know. He whispered this truth, words barely more than a breath in the storm of his mind. What kind of life had his daughter lived after leaving home? Whom had she leaned on? Who had stood by her side? Whatever the answers, he himself had refused to seek them out. He'd chosen, time and again, not to look. She rejected my way of life, so I would not recognize hers. That's all it ever was. Just by clinging to his perspective, convinced of his own rectitude, he preserved his sense of honor. But now, in this moment, what he'd convinced himself was rejection, shifted and twisted, revealing itself as something else entirely. Maybe, just maybe, he was the one who'd truly been left behind. Had he lost something vital? Something only a family could offer? Without ever realizing it? His gaze fell, and he caught sight of the wine in his glass, its surface trembling, rippling softly. Only then did Richard notice his own hand was still shaking. Oh, how much responsibility did that young man bear when he stood here tonight? What sort of resolve did he carry, crossing that threshold on Margaret's behalf? All at once, a new gravity pressed down upon him. Each answer crashed in, late but unrelenting. Richard had never expected that. At his own retirement celebration, a night meant for joy and honor, one small business card would rattle him to his core. It was as if he'd been handed a mirror, one that reflected not only his life's successes, but the wounds he'd hidden, the truths he'd smothered, everything left said and unsaid inside the bonds of family. All the years of suppressed feelings, of glossed-over missteps, of never really talking, never honestly seeing, seemed to flicker in the jet-black sheen of that card. Someone laid a gentle hand on his shoulder. The MC's polite voice cut through the haze. Would you please prepare a few remarks for everyone? Richard nodded faintly. He slid the card into his inside pocket, not so much putting away a card as tucking away a question that now pressed, restless, at his heart. That very question would, in time, pushed Richard Collins to take a subway and then a cab clear across Manhattan to stand before his daughter, not as a patriarch doling out judgments, but as a father chasing answers he'd never allowed himself to seek until now. The sky over New York was as deep and cold and clear as winter glass. That morning, Richard Collins waited silently on the sidewalk before an immense glass and steel office tower, a 7-minute walk north from Penn Station. His suit was old, but pressed with exact care. His brown leather shoes scuffed but lovingly polished. He carried no bag, just a business card, folded and refolded until its corners had softened, wedged into his breast pocket. He glanced at his reflection in the building's mirror-bright facade. Drawing a careful breath, he tugged lightly at his tie. Then he stepped inside. This was Minato Creative Research Inc., the surging tech company founded and run by Stephen Parker, Margaret's husband. At the reception desk, a young woman in a navy blazer greeted him with a practiced, welcoming smile. "How can I help you today, sir?" Richard paused, searching for the right words. I don't have an appointment. But if possible, I'd like to ask for just a moment of Margaret Parker's time." The receptionist hesitated, then nodded. "Just a minute, sir. I'll see if she's available." As she slipped away, Richard sank onto a polished leather sofa near the windows. All around, office workers hurried about, voices echoing through glass-walled conference rooms, faces intent with focus and drive. Meetings unfolded behind etched glass. Laughter erupted somewhere, quickly hushed. Here, Richard felt as if time itself flowed differently, everyone moving twice as fast, their lives surging ahead, leaving him an odd, unmoving quiet. Moments later, footsteps sounded behind the reception desk. He looked up. It was Margaret herself. She wore a crisp white shirt with soft blue slacks. Her hair brushed back from her face, her manner poised and calm. In Margaret's eyes was a stillness edged with feeling held carefully in check. "Dad." Richard stood, attempting to gather the words in his chest, then bowed his head, low, slow, and for the first time in his life, fully and unequivocally. "I'm so sorry. I truly never understood." His voice shook. The wrinkles in his brow folded and deepened with each syllable. Margaret's eyes never left his. She listened, then answered. Quiet and unwavering. "I never wanted you to recognize me, Dad. All I ever needed was for you to simply see me, for who I am as a person." Richard could not lift his head. Instead, as the weight of all his years pressed in, tears rose and finally spilled down his face. This was a man who had built his entire life on dignity and pride. Never, not once had he let anyone see him weep. But now, in front of his eldest daughter, Richard allowed the words that had gone unsaid for decades to finally soften, to finally fall apart. "All my life I chased after what seemed right. I clung to appearances, to honor, to the idea of family as something determined only by pride. And somewhere along the way, I lost what really mattered." He reached up, halting, careful, and pulled the business card from his pocket. It was the very same black card Stephen had handed him that night in Chicago. Still glossy, still solemn, almost heavy as iron in his hand. He held it out, not for display, but as an unspoken admission. The world Margaret had built was something all her own, beyond his pride, beyond his reach, but always worthy of respect. Richard looked at his daughter with eyes raw from tears. I want to try to understand, Margaret. Not as your father judging you, but as a man, finally ready to listen to his own child." Margaret stood silent for a long moment, then smiled, just a little, wry and understanding. She reached for her father's hand, folding fingers around his. Not in restitution, but in recognition. The past was not fixed. The pain did not disappear, but the distance, for now, no longer grew wider. There, in the lobby of a Manhattan office tower, where glass caught the bright winter sun, a new kind of American family scene came quietly into being. A flawed father, a resilient daughter, and the hope not for forgiveness, but for understanding and a life remade, one honest conversation at a time. When he looked at that business card for the first time, his knees trembled. It wasn't fear or shame exactly. but a kind of reckoning that left Richard Collins quietly stunned in the lobby of the soaring New York office. In that moment, Richard finally understood what he himself had truly severed. All those years ago, it was as if a great iron door, once locked tight, swung open inside his own heart, letting in a wind he'd never dared feel. That moment, his admission, his confession, was both a reckoning and a kind of repentance. Margaret Collins, standing before him in the blue morning light, closed her eyes just for an instant, a flicker soft and sure, then opened them again. "The fact that you came here, Dad, that you made the choice to stand here with me now, that's all the answer I need. It's enough for me, truly." Her voice was quiet, the words almost gentle. And for the first time that day, Margaret smiled. It was not a smile of reunion, nor exactly forgiveness. It was a subtle recognition of distance, a mature, silent pact between two adults. A space, shaped by years and choices, was at last simply acknowledged. "Then, I guess, I'll be going," Richard said, the words barely there. He made a move to turn, but Margaret stepped a pace closer, speaking almost in a whisper. "I'll be in touch. Next time, it'll be from me." He nodded, just once, a small but honest gesture. Richard turned away, crossing the lobby to where the glass doors spilled sunlight across the floor. For a moment, he looked out at Manhattan's morning sky, a patchwork of silver and blue between the skyscrapers, before he stepped back into the streaming tide of the city, away from the place where so much had changed, or perhaps had simply come clear. He carried no newfound joy, nor any trophy of lost time returned. There was only this, the strength to admit to himself what he'd lost, and the steadiness to carry that truth forward. Even after Richard exited the building, he found himself rooted to the sidewalk, unable to step into the rush of commuters just yet. He stood for several minutes on that midtown block, the wind tugging the edges of his old brown overcoat, the thin morning sunlight flickering in the glass canyons above. She never once let anger color her voice. He turned the meeting over, words and expressions replaying within him. Margaret had every right to shout, to accuse, to hurl all those years of abandonment and judgment back at him. But she did not. Every word she'd spoken was measured, calm, careful, and true. Her quiet dignity stung deeper than any outcry could. She had not asked him to forget the past, nor to erase it. And even as she spoke of someday reaching out herself, it was a kindness beyond what he felt he'd earned. How much meaning lies in a promise so small that she would be the one to reach out someday? It was a simple offer, yet Richard felt the weight of it as if it were a burden forged in iron. He hadn't been asked to reclaim the old roles, to insist on family as it once was, nor had she written him off. She had, with a subtle, careful strength, named the distance between them. She had made space for something new, a new shape, born not from forgiveness, but acceptance. He knew, in his bones, that if he pushed too hard now, if he tried to force his way back, he would wound her again. And yet, to turn away completely, to vanish, to cut the cord and be nothing at all, was an impossibility he could never bear. It was that space, delicate and uncertain, that Margaret offered him. Next time. "I'll be in touch." A future, however slim, quietly opening a door for something more. As the city thrummed on around him, people streaming by on urgent errands, Richard's slow walk toward Penn Station was out of rhythm with everyone else. He moved at a pace so deliberate that others edged around him, impatient but silent. He made it as far as Bryant Park before stopping, drawn to a green bench beneath the soft arms of a big maple tree. Richard sat for a long time, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze drifting far beyond the passing crowds. The card, Stephen's card, the one that had upended everything? He pulled it from his pocket, its edges worn and softened from handling. He turned it between his fingers, not really reading the words, but letting the stark black and white of it remind him of what had changed. He'd erased her, years before, her name, her number, all traces gone from his phone. It had felt necessary back then. A brutal declaration that he would not budge from the path he'd chosen. Now, that erasure was a wound he could not ignore. Well, maybe it all starts by putting her name back again. Small steps, all he could offer. Not to mend what could not be mended overnight, but to acknowledge, truly acknowledge, the life his daughter had made for herself. And as Richard sat in the park, his thoughts turned quietly inside themselves. She was no longer a daughter to shepherd or scold. She was a woman, her own person trusted by others, standing firm in the world she'd shaped herself. He felt both pride and a dissonant kind of grief. To recognize her as an equal, he'd have to put aside old notions, break apart the systems of value that had governed his every choice. And yet, sitting in that city park, Richard realized he might finally be strong enough to do it. She expects nothing from me anymore. She's not waiting to be rescued, not reaching back for approval. That door is closed. But still, as her father, I want to return something, anything. As he thought this, some old bitterness within him, the ache of all those unshed words, began, at last, to melt away. Far off, the sound of a subway rumble rose faintly, mixing with the chorus of horns and chatter drifting from 6th Avenue. It was only inside his own heart that a new kind of silence was forming. The deep hush that means a lost tether has been tied, however faint, back to the center. Days later, Richard Collins rode the Amtrak back to his childhood hometown. In the outer reaches of Illinois, the train rushed past snowy fields and rivers edged with ice. When he arrived, the familiar landscape of small American houses and the dormant hush of Main Street greeted him. His house, an old 2-story set on a gentle hill, waited with quiet patience at the edge of town, worn white paint and a tired porch swing all that was left of decades gone by. Richard had lived there once with Evelyn, his late wife, and 3 daughters. Now, after the children's departures and years of growing silence, he found himself alone on most days. Since the events in New York, he had declined every request for interviews from local papers or industry magazines, and even the rare plea from former colleagues. He answered everyone the same way. I don't have anything to say worth printing. But the real truth was simpler. He'd shared the words that mattered with the only person who needed them. There was, finally, nothing left to defend or explain. That winter's morning, Richard woke before dawn. He stoked the battered coffee maker, scrambled eggs for one, and spent the hours sorting old bank statements in the lamplight. Most afternoons he swept the front steps, or read in the worn chair by the window, or visited the grocer just to hear voices. This rhythm, simple and steady, brought a kind of peace. One foggy day, drifting through the cool and quiet house, Richard opened an old desk drawer and found a package of stationery, its edges yellowed but never used. He sat at the tiny kitchen table, uncapped a blue ballpoint pen, and began to write. He left the letter unsealed and set it, quietly, on the mantel where the sunlight from the window found it at all hours. More than anything, he needed those words within sight so he would not forget them. On the page, in Richard's blocky but careful print, it read, "My daughter is no disgrace to this family." Margaret was the first Collins to live honestly, to follow her own truth, to be unafraid of what others might think. It was the briefest, and in its way the most powerful, judgment he'd ever etched. Spring brought a softening to the house. The snow melted, birds sang again at the edges of morning, and the scent of grass replaced that of ice and coal. One Sunday, the Collins family called a small gathering, just immediate relations. A plain meal in the dining room, technically a retirement party for Richard, though he himself had not planned to attend. Instead, Evelyn took his place at the table. She arrived quietly, her movements gentle, her eyes sharp and caring. Without a fuss, she walked to where Margaret was seated. Even said nothing. She didn't say, "I'm glad you're here," or "I'm sorry." Instead, she simply reached out and placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder, her touch warm and unshaken. That supple, wordless gesture, more than any apology, reached all the way into Margaret's heart. Evelyn's eyes glistened, but they held no accusation or pleading, only a rich, abiding softness, the solidarity of one person recognizing this simple, heavy reality. I am here, with you, now. For a moment, even the thick air in the room seemed to ease. The old roles and sharp corners of family had faded, leaving behind just people, each facing the other as they truly were. In that hush, for the first time, Margaret felt a new kind of beginning. Not a big reunion, not some glossy reunion, but two individuals bearing witness to each other's presence, a space in which neither owed the other, but each one belonged. That night, back in her own room beneath a tall window in her city apartment, Margaret found herself lingering by her bookshelf, letting her hand fall on an old picture frame tucked among the worn novels. She picked it up and stared at the photograph, herself as a shy little girl, grinning, squished between her father and mother. Her father's arm lay across her shoulders. Her mother's hand rested light as a feather at her side. A family, once, truly, together. She traced that old image, throat thick, eyes wide. Somewhere inside, Margaret knew, you cannot return to a vanished past. What was lost is gone forever. But maybe, she thought as she set the photo back in its niche, you can carry something precious forward, new and true. The path was hers now, shaped by her own hope, her work, and her willingness to see others whole. And in that quiet, Margaret smiled. Just a little. A promise as small and as shining as the morning. Even as these thoughts drifted through her mind, Margaret found herself surprised by a softer conviction. But maybe, from this point on, if everything's different, maybe there's some way to build something new. That gentle hope first sprouted in her heart, almost before she realized it. Later that night, she unlocked her apartment window with care. The cool summer air flooded the curtains, carrying in the sounds of crickets and the faint shimmer of city twilight. Overhead, the young moon floated pale and serene, a quiet witness to all that was changing. Several days passed. One ordinary afternoon, a delivery truck stopped at the walk-up. Margaret called home. She found a plain package on her doorstep, small enough to hold in one hand. The return address, written in her father's bold, blocky hand, stood out more than any shipping label. Inside, she discovered a hand-carved wooden box and a letter. Within the box, padded side by side, rested a wooden bookmark carefully whittled, the surface scarred and polished by repeated shaping, and a battered, well-loved fountain pen, the sort her father had used all her childhood. Above them lay a single sheet of heavy ivory paper, her father's handwriting, careful but uneven. The letter read, "There's a chance it's too late to express some things in words. But I've realized that while I'm alive, I want to do as many of them as I can. Even if it's just a few. To say thank you, while saying it still matters." Family, Margaret reflected, is often something you only come to understand after losing something. Maybe too late, maybe not. But even if understanding takes too long, even if you find yourself circling back time and again, that first step, reaching for understanding, might be your one hope for not letting a relationship fade completely away. Margaret finished reading and cradled the bookmark in her palm. The wood, cherry by the scent and grain, was soft at the edges from being whittled and reworked, the grooves deepened by hands learning how to say what could not be spoken. At the back, delicately scorched into the base, were the words, "A life lived truly is a life that withstands in stillness." Her father, who spent years pushing her to chase abstractions, power, status, visibility, had gifted her an idea that seemed the opposite of what he'd demanded. Now, through his own work and hand, by sending it to his daughter, the change in him was as clear and sturdy as the wood itself. Far away, in the quiet town where he now lived, Richard Collins, too, was beginning to shift in small and telling ways. Once, his days ticked by in the military neatness of a ledger. Now he found solace in things that were neither measured nor admired, pencil sketches of wildflowers from the backyard, reading library books aloud simply to savor the sound of his own voice echoing. In a still house. For the first time, his days contained time given to no one but himself. Evelyn, her mother, wrote letters to Margaret every few weeks. Her style spare and plain seasonal notes, bits of local goings-on. The backs of the envelopes always bore the same refrain, inked carefully beside the flap. "We're looking forward to seeing you again. Whenever that may be." A silent promise, You are not forgotten, no matter the distance. And so it was that Margaret, too, came to cradle a quiet, persistent resolve, a determination to step through the next door, even if she did not yet know what she would find on the other side. The seasons eased from summer's fever into autumn's hush, golden leaves collecting on city sidewalks, cooler air pooling along the stoops and lawns. Margaret Parker. Her married name stood one evening in her modest Manhattan apartment, looking out at the glow from a rice cooker on the counter. Steam shimmered up from a fresh batch of rice. In the kitchen, she could smell the mellow blend of vegetable stew, grilled trout, and, nestled in the fridge, containers of her own homemade pickles and sesame tofu. On the shelves, produce from the morning's farmer's market bell peppers, curly kale, shiny red radishes, waited, each a small testament to a new, self-chosen way of life. That night, Maggie's apartment filled with laughter and gentle voices. Her writing workshop was meeting in person for the first time since early summer. The class gathered around a table barely larger than a school desk. High schoolers eager to find their voice, mothers who found time to write. Between carpool and bedtime, retirees, some shy, some boisterous, every one of them hungry for meaning in the lines they crafted. They came, in one way or another, to learn how to live in their own words. Margaret welcomed them not with elaborate introductions, but a single quiet offering. She brought the pot of steaming rice to the table's center and set it down gently, letting the scent melt the room's remaining ice. "Let's eat." Someone whispered a word of thanks, and with that, each person turned to the next, passing bowls and utensils, inviting, offering, the tap-tap of chopsticks, no, forks and spoons, sturdy American filled the air, natural and gentle. There were no ornate decorations, no over-the-top hospitality, but if you stood silently and let yourself feel, the room pulsed with the presence of hearts, lined up side by side. Not names and labels, but something warmer, softer. In the lull that followed the first bites, a young woman paused, miso soup cradled in her palms. "This tastes like something I grew up with. Like home." "Yeah," another agreed, voice thick with feeling. "It's like being where you belong." Margaret didn't laugh. She only nodded, sliding the next bowl across the table. Thought everyone, she thought, is given a place to come back to. But anyone can make a place to welcome others. For a moment, that truth grew strong inside her, anchoring her more surely than any parent's blessing. Later, as plates emptied and coffee cooled, one student asked the question that had hovered all night. "Mrs. Parker, did you always know how to make a space like this? Was it always easy for you?" Margaret shook her head, gaze lowered, eyes far away for an instant. "There was a time when I was told to get out. Not just from a house, but from a conversation, a memory, even the safety of a name. For a long time, I thought I'd never have a place again myself." She let the silence fill the table. No one dared to break it. "But I realized something. Just because someone takes away your welcome, doesn't mean you should ever take it from someone else. That's why I do this, not to make family in the old sense, but to offer what I can." No one clapped. A few eyes shone in the warmth. The openness that bloomed in that room wasn't loud or showy. It was the kind of understanding that makes a place feel like home, no matter the actual walls. As her guests headed for the foyer to put on shoes and gather their bags, one lingered by the door, voice gentle. "Do you regret that night? The night your family told you to leave?" Margaret paused, hand on the old wood of the apartment door. "No," she said, the answer ringing low and clean. "But sometimes, I wish I'd been kinder to myself back then. I wasn't running away. I was protecting something. It just took me years to see it that way." The other woman nodded, squeezed Margaret's hand. "I'm glad I came tonight." With that, she stepped out into the cool corridor, leaving Margaret alone in her quiet kitchen. It was late. As the city noise dimmed, Margaret poured herself tea, drawing her father's letter once again from the desk. She read the now familiar line, letting it rest in the warmth of her heart. To say thank you while saying it still matters. The past, she knew, was unchangeable. She would never reclaim the home she lost, nor erase the harsh words spoken long ago. But the past, carried forward and reshaped by action and honesty, could become fertile ground for gentler choices. Every bowl passed, every story heard, every room where the unspoken was finally given voice. That was her way of remaking belonging. And quietly, week by week, person by person, Margaret helped nurture others into living by their own words. It was never about calling out names, never about raising her voice. It was about offering warmth in the quiet moments. When people needed it most. Not everyone is given a place to return, she began to say. But wherever you would wish to return, you'll always find someone's care and thoughtfulness there. That was the home. That Margaret, at last, had built in a dressless place, shaped by respect and gentle acceptance, not by forced reunion or old roles. At the end of one of those evenings, standing alone with the city light flickering through her blinds, Margaret let herself glance back, not at a person or a door, but at the journey taken. Every person leaves a place for a reason. But the courage to return when possible depends not on the scale of hurt, but on how wide and deep one's kindness can reach. To you, reading now, was there ever a place you felt cast out from? A room, a house, a table where your name went missing? Was it really not your home at all? Or maybe, was it a place where even you, deep down, struggled to forgive yourself? What matters is not that you could not stay, but that you survived. What matters most is that you carry forward the finest part of what home could mean into every meal you share, every gentle word you offer, every empty place you quietly fill. And if, someday, the moment comes, if a letter or a voice or a memory arrives across the seasons, may you have the dignity to answer and the strength to build for someone else the welcome you once needed most. This is how Margaret Collins, once cast out, learned to live by her own words, changing the past not by rewriting it, but by teaching others how to shape their futures with care, one invitation, one table, one story at a time. But maybe, just maybe, right now, right in your own hands, is there a business card, quiet and unassuming, that could gently move another person's heart? Not as a title, not as a front, but as proof that you have truly, honestly lived with every ounce of effort, no matter who might have looked away or given up. So please, if only for someone else's sake, try offering that card forward, share it, openly, with another. It may not shake the room, it doesn't have to make a sound, but in that silent gesture, in the simple courage to reach out with what is yours alone, you just might hear, softly, steadily, the world itself begin to change around you. A new kind of possibility, carried not in a name or a role, but in the living proof of your story and your care. That is the invitation this life extends, to place what you have gained, shaped, and chosen right into another's hand. If you give it honestly and with no expectations, you may help set whole new chains of kindness and courage into motion. You may discover the sound of change isn't loud or showy, but comes disguised as the peace that settles quietly between two people, as the world, bit by bit, grows larger and more humane, one business card at a time.